Understanding Relativism, Part 1. Welcome to this multi-part series on relativism or relativity. There's probably going to be 2 parts, maybe a 3rd part, we'll see, because there's so much material to cover here and it's quite complex. But also I should tell you right off the bat that if you're looking for an in-depth look at the physics of Einstein's general relativity theory, that's not what we're going to be talking about here today. We're talking about relativism as a sort of as a philosophical topic, and even though, of course, Einstein's general relativity theory is one instance of relativism, and it's an important one, and we will be touching upon it, it's not going to be a deep dive into the physics of Einstein. That's something maybe we'll do in the future at some point. But what you have to understand about relativism and relativity is that it goes far beyond just physics. There's many different kinds of relativity, and we'll be discussing many of those here today. So actually, this topic is more foundational than any kind of individual physical theory. We're going to be talking about many different theories within science and philosophy and morality and ethics. So I'm really excited about this topic. I've actually been wanting to talk about it for probably over a year now. I've been preparing my notes. I've been preparing my thoughts. Because this is tricky to explain. It's very easy to misunderstand relativism, really easy, and this makes this series complicated and really very advanced. So I just want to warn you to keep an open mind, as usual, with these very foundational topics. This is tricky stuff, easy to misunderstand, and that's because it's threatening to worldviews. No matter what kind of worldview you have, it's going to be threatened by some of the things that relativity reveals. So just keep an open mind. Think about this stuff critically for yourself. Don't just believe me. Don't just accept it. And hold on to your objections. I know you're going to have a lot of objections to various things that I'll be saying. That's natural and normal. And don't worry, I got you covered. At the very end of this video, there's going to be a lot of objections which we cover. And we're probably going to cover some more in part 2. So let's begin. One more word of warning. The arguments I'm going to be making here are not going to be merely a rehashing of postmodernism or cultural relativism as you find in many universities and modern academia. This goes way deeper than that. And there are important differences between the way that I'll be presenting relativity versus postmodernism. In fact, there are some very important points that postmodernism misses and doesn't understand. And we'll be touching upon those. And especially in part 1, we'll be talking about various limitations of postmodernism. So let's begin with sort of a foundation here. We need a foundation to work off of. What is relativism? How is it understood within philosophy? I'm going to be reading you some quotes here from various sources to get us just grounded in what relativism is. So here's the first one by Wilhelm Krug. He says, relativism is, quote, the assumption that everything which we experience and think, including the self, the idea of reason, truth, morality, religion, etc., is only something relative and therefore has no essential endurance and no universal validity. End quote. So that's a very good encapsulation of what it is. But let's go a little deeper, a little bit deeper. If we turn to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a great resource for philosophy topics, it's sort of like the Wikipedia of philosophy. It says relativism, and they have a very good, by the way, they have a very good page on relativism, which has tons and tons of stuff that I can't possibly cover all of it. They say the following, quote, relativism is the doctrine that knowledge, truth, and morality exist in relation to culture, society, or historical context and are not absolute. It goes on to say, quote, relativism, roughly put, is the view that truth and falsity, right and wrong, standards of reasoning, and procedures of justification are products of differing conventions and frameworks of assessment, and that their authority is confined to the context giving rise to them. Relativists characteristically insist that if something is only relatively so, then there can be no framework-independent vantage point from which the matter of the thing in question can be established. end quote. And it goes on to say that relativism means, quote, that some phenomena X, whether it's values, epistemic, aesthetic, and ethical norms, experiences, judgments, and even the world itself, is somehow dependent upon some underlying variable Y. For example, paradigms, cultures, conceptual schemes, belief systems, and language. Such that, for example, justice is relative to local norms. Truth is relative to a language game. Temperature is relative to the scale that we use. There are no universal criteria for adjudicating between differing worldviews. There could be more than one right way of describing what there is. End quote. And lastly, it says, quote, one main attraction of relativism is that it offers a way of settling or explaining away what appear to be profound disagreements on questions of value, knowledge, and ontology. And the relativizing parameter often involves people, their beliefs, cultures, and languages. End quote. And I should also add to that list the biggest relativizing parameter, which is states of consciousness, which this article on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on relativism doesn't even address at all, the biggest thing. So even though there's a lot of good points within this article, ultimately the things that we're going to be considering here go way deeper than anything that modern Western philosophy or postmodernism really understands about relativity. It's tricky because on the one hand, we need to say that everything that human beings know and believe and understand about the world is absolutely relative. All of it is relative. But on the other hand, we also need to leave room for the absolute truth. That is not relative. And this interplay between relativity and the absolute truth, whatever that is, and I'm not explaining yet here what that is, because that's a whole big can of worms that we're going to be focusing on in other episodes. In fact, I've discussed it in other episodes. It's not really important for the purposes of this discussion, but you need to leave room open for the absolute. So just keep that in mind. Now, there are different kinds of relativism. There's social and cultural, moral and ethical, epistemic, and then the deepest version, which is the ontological and the physical. So, for example, social and cultural relativism would be things like, different societies and countries have different cuisines and different laws, of course. And ethical and moral relativism would mean that depending on which era you live in, there are different moral standards, different ethical standards. And so you can't just say that there's one right one. It depends on which era. Era becomes a relativizing parameter, see. Epistemic relativism is all about knowledge, differences in how we see the world, how we understand the world, how we know the world. So, for example, there are different epistemologies. Science is one epistemology. Another epistemology might be religion or mysticism or voodoo or witchcraft and so on. So there are different ways of knowing the world. Which one is the best one? Well, who knows? Is there even a best one? A lot of people assume that there is a best one. A lot of people assume that there is a best culture or a best ethical system or one absolute one that's absolutely true, and all the other ones, of course, are wrong. This view I call absolutism. Absolutism is sort of the opposite of relativism. If relativism says that everything is just up for grabs and is socially constructed, so to speak, and is just subjective, absolutism says that no, it's just the opposite. There's a hard, external, objective, physical reality. There's a set of facts that's true for everybody. And then, sure, people can have different opinions about it, but they're just wrong if they don't got the facts. That's absolutism. There's a lot of problems with absolutism, and also you need to distinguish between absolutism versus the absolute or absolute truth. This is truth with a capital T. These are two very distinct, almost opposite things. So when I say absolutism, I do not mean absolute truth. I mean a worldview in which you think that good and bad are objectively determined within reality, and that you believe that there's a hard set of common facts, objective facts that we all share. And then there's ontological relativism or metaphysical relativism, which actually goes to the physical substrate of reality. And what it says is that there actually is not a physical world that's the same for everybody. And a lot of people have difficulty buying that. So usually, if you accept relativity, you accept some degree of it, but you don't want to go too far. So the question for many philosophers is, where do you draw the line? Do you draw it at social and cultural relativism? Like, do you accept that? Most people these days would accept that different cultures have different cuisines and customs, and that there is no one best culture. Now, of course, many people even struggle with that, admitting that. They're absolutists, and they tend to be dogmatic and very closed-minded. So that's not a very sophisticated position to deny social and cultural relativism. But still, many people manage to do that. Many conservatives and right-wingers take that position. Then, of course, there's those who admit of moral and ethical relativism, that good and bad is just a matter of perspective. And of course, the conservatives and right-wingers tend to reject that. So, people draw that line at different places. Then some people go even further and they admit of epistemic relativism. They say, well, science is not the only way to understand the world. There's other epistemologies, and science is not necessarily the best one, nor is logic and rationality necessarily the best one. Maybe there's certain advantages to science, but then certain disadvantages as well. Maybe we'll discover some new epistemology in the future. So some people are as open-minded as admitting that. But then oftentimes, and this is by this point, it's almost everybody, they draw a firm boundary between all of those relativisms that I just mentioned and then ontological and physical relativism. So when it comes to the actual physical world, for example, the Earth, do you believe that the Earth is a real object that is objectively true for all beings? Or is it only true for you? Or like only true for human beings? Or only true if you believe in it, so to speak? See, most people would say, no, Leo, the Earth, now you're getting crazy. The Earth, that's just hard facts, man. That's just reality. You can't say that the Earth is just a belief. Maybe you might say that the Earth is flat or round. That might be a belief, but that there is an Earth, you can't dispute that, right? Or can you? See, ontological relativism actually challenges that notion that there is an objective world, an objective Earth that you're sitting on right now. Is there some merit to that view? Well, we'll explore that in a minute. So, which of these are true and which are false? The problem is that when they teach all of this to you in a philosophy classroom, in some university, or when you read it online on a Wikipedia philosophy page or on this Stanford Encyclopedia of philosophy, they don't actually give you a clear answer. They just kind of like leave it open, and then you're on your own to figure it out. Well, I'm going to give you a clear answer. And the answer is that all of them are true, but not in the way that you think. So there's wrinkles here that are tricky to explain, and this is what we're going to be explaining here in some detail. So not only are all of those true, it actually goes way deeper than you can possibly imagine, the relativity. Way deeper. The relativity, in fact, goes so deep that it goes full circle and turns into the pure absolute truth. But you have to distinguish that from your ideas being absolutely true. So when I say absolute truth, I'm not talking about relativism as a worldview. So I'm not saying that relativism as a worldview is absolutely true. Nor am I even saying that what I'm saying here to you is absolutely true. None of that is the absolute. The absolute is something beyond all of that, that grounds this entire conversation we're having, and that grounds all of human experience. So what that is mysterious, and for now we're just going to leave it as a sort of unknown variable. Just keep in mind that it's there. How do you know that it's there? Well, of course, unless you've directly become conscious of it, you don't know. So you're just taking my word for it for now. But my claim is that you can become directly conscious of the absolute, and you can know it absolutely. But of course, until you do become conscious of it, you don't really know. So as far as you know from your position, maybe I'm full of shit. Maybe I'm deluded. Maybe I'm lying. Maybe there is no such thing as absolute. But then again, maybe there is, so just keep your mind open. Relativity means that you only know things compared to other things. That's the essence of relativity. You can't know something as if you were just an impartial, objective observer looking down upon the cosmos from God's point of view, so to speak. That is not our position as humans here on Earth. We are intimately involved with the process of understanding the world. We are not unbiased, objective observers. Even when we're being scientific, even when we're being mathematical and hyperlogical, we're still participating in this whole process of understanding things, of making sense of our life. And we do this process of making sense of life by comparing different parts of life to other parts of life. And this is how we get a handle on what life is. And this is relativity. So here are some basic examples of relativity. An elephant is large relative to a mouse. How do you know what large and small are, other than through comparing different parts of reality to each other? See, that's how you did it. When you were born, you didn't know what small and large were. You learned that through experience by comparing different parts of reality. Now, of course, this seems so obvious, but you don't overlook the obvious. It's in the obvious where we really get tricked. This stuff is not obvious at all. It's easy to accept for most people that, yeah, Leo, I understand that an elephant is large only relative to a mouse, and that actually it's tiny relative to the entire planet. That's so obvious. But just notice that as much as you might hate relativism, you will admit to this basic example. So you're already a relativist. It's just a question of where do you draw the line? And what I'm going to show you here as we keep going is that the line itself that you draw is relative. So where you draw the line depends upon you, depends upon your worldview, depends upon your experiences and your beliefs. And that actually there is no such line within reality. Some more examples for you. A triangle, as we know from geometry class, adds up to 180 degrees if you add up all three angles. But this is only relatively true if we are talking about geometry done on a flat plane, which is Euclidean standard geometry, the kind you learned in high school. But then there are other kinds of geometries. If you do geometry on a curved surface, depending on how it curves, the triangle will not add up to 180 degrees. See? So we have to admit of relativism within geometry. Or even, let's take an even more basic example. You take a look at a glass that's exactly 50% full, but at the same time, it's also 50% empty. So which is it? Well, it's both, of course. In fact, to say that a glass is half full or half empty is actually identical. But also, at the same time, it's not quite identical because it gives you a different flavor, a different interpretation. It means something different in your mind, whether you think of your bank account, for example, as being half full or half empty. It'll give you different emotions. It'll give you different motivations about what you should do about that. See? And notice what's interesting about relativism is that it opens us up to the possibility that what we might call the quote-unquote facts of the situation don't have to change for our perspective on it to change significantly. So how the facts affect us, how the world affects us, may not so much depend upon what the world factually is, but rather upon how you look at it, what perspective you take. The Eiffel Tower is 1,063 feet tall. But this is not absolutely true. This is a relative truth, depending upon the velocity at which you're moving at when you're looking at the Eiffel Tower. So one thing that Einstein showed is that actually the length of physical objects will change depending on how fast you're moving. And if you're moving close to the speed of light as you're approaching an object, let's say you're flying towards the Eiffel Tower straight from the top, like from outer space, down, and the tower is standing like this and you're flying down towards it, but of course you're very far away. And maybe you're looking at it through a telescope or some binoculars. Then actually what you'll see is that the length of the tower will change and be different. And so literally, according to Einstein, the tower does not have a fixed length. There is no way that the Eiffel Tower is. It only is how it looks to you given your frame of reference that you're moving at, given your velocity and given your relative position to the tower, of course, given the tower's velocity relative to you. That's a very twisted, relativistic, counterintuitive notion, which we'll be talking more about as we keep going here. That's general relativity in a nutshell. Another example is with science. Is science true? Many people today would say, yes, Leo, science is true. It's proven. But not so simple, you see. Science is true relative to what? It's relative to the past. 21st century science appears true. It's more true than 15th century science. That's correct. But today's science is going to look so faulty and wrong 1,000 years from now, in the 30th century. See? So this is very important to keep in mind, because otherwise you fall into the trap of thinking that science is just true all the time. No, science is not true all the time. Science has many inaccuracies and errors in it, as we know from the past, if you've studied the history of science. Science has gotten reality very wrong in the past. And more so, science is still getting reality very wrong today. It's just that it's very hard for us to see because we're sort of on the bleeding edge of the future. It's hard for us to see where science is misunderstanding reality. Because if we knew where it was misunderstanding reality, then we would have advanced science by a whole generation. But of course, that is what science is doing, is it's advancing itself every single day. But it does so slowly, it creeps along. So you can't tell where science will go 1,000 years from now. Or at least most people can't. Some of us can. So in this sense, science is very relativistic. And also it's relativistic in the sense that science is not the only way to study and understand the world. There are other methods which are different from science and sometimes even superior to science. A lot of people are not even aware of this possibility. They think science is the only way. They think science has a monopoly on truth, which of course it doesn't. So these are just some basic examples to start to get you to understand what we mean by relativity. Of course, you can look around you in the world and you can see thousands of examples of relativity. For example, even when you just like go to a restaurant and you sit down with your family, some members of your family will enjoy the food. Other members of the family will hate the food. It's the exact same food. So what changed? Well, of course, individual tastes, how people perceive it changes. And so that's what makes reality actually so interesting, is that there's so many different points of view and perspectives that we can take on it. It's so relativistic that it really stretches credulity. A lot of people, they deny this relativism by saying that, oh, well, those people are just wrong, they're just stupid, they're just crazy, or they're just ignorant. But that itself actually is the ignorant and the deluded position. So what you really need to do to start to understand relativism is you need to open your mind and really be willing to give credence to other people's points of view, such that you don't dismiss them too quickly. Otherwise, what happens is you become an absolutist and you think that your position is the only right one and that all other people are just deluded. And of course, this is how you create a sense of reality. That becomes very important later. But before we get into all that, let's go through some of the history of relativism, especially within Western intellectual tradition, Western culture. So let's rewind the clock 2,500 years and go back all the way to the ancient Greeks, to the ancient Greek philosopher known as Anaximander, whose dates were 610 to 546 BC. He was one of the very, very, very earliest philosophers in the West. Really, you could say philosophy sort of began with him and his contemporaries. And he resolved a very interesting philosophical and at that time scientific problem, because remember, back then, philosophy and science were the same field. There was no distinction between them. So, what was the problem that he resolved? Well, it was the problem of the floating earth. Contrary to what some people think, the ancient Greeks actually knew that the earth was a globe, that it was round. And for them, though, the tricky question wasn't whether the earth was round or flat. They understood that it was round. What puzzled them was, how could a round earth sit suspended in empty space? Almost all ancient cultures assumed that the earth rested on some support, that it couldn't just float in empty space. Because the assumption was that if it was sitting in empty space, it would fall down. And of course, the earth isn't falling down because we don't feel it falling down. So that means it must be supported by something. This was the way people thought back then. Now look, what you have to understand is that this might seem silly to you that people thought this way, but you have to really put yourself in their shoes and really look at it from their epistemic perspective, from their sort of veil of ignorance. They didn't have the benefit of standing on the shoulders of giants and visionaries and great scientists and philosophers that we have today. You know, we have 2,500 years of hindsight and standing on the shoulders of giants. So this was a real puzzle back then in Anaximander's time, and he came up with the solution for it. And here was his argument. Here was his great, brilliant insight. This was an insight equivalent to Newton's insight about the apple falling and being pulled down by gravity. This was an insight equivalent to Einstein's insight about the nature of light and space and time. And his insight was very simple. He said the following: the earth can sit unsupported in an empty void because it is falling and it is pulled equally in all directions. And the only way he could have come up with that line of reasoning is by realizing that up and down are actually relative. So something as simple as up and down being relative, which we all understand today, at least I hope so, this was not obvious at all to early humans. Because our direct experience is that there is an up and there is a down. And all our lives we live within this field, this polarized field of up and down. And it just seems that objects just intrinsically fall down. And staying up is inherently difficult. And up is always that way, and down is always this way. And no matter where you are on the earth, that's true for you. But then, of course, if you think about it a little bit deeper, you realize that, well, wait a minute. If I'm on the North Pole and up is this way and down is that way, and then if I'm on the South Pole, it has to be reversed. See? Relativity. That's the only way the earth could be round, is if that relativity was true. You could see how a lot of people could refuse to accept that the earth is round simply on the grounds that means that up and down are relative. And their direct experience clearly shows them, and they have decades of this experience because, Most people have not flown to different poles of the Earth, especially back then. There was no such possibility. So your direct experience was simply that up is that way and down is this way, and it can't be otherwise. You see, the mind was locked into that paradigm. And Anaximander's great insight was that, in a sense, Earth is falling, but it's falling in all directions at once. Therefore, it's sitting still. See how it kind of goes full circle? A very clever bit of thinking. And of course, that's exactly how it is. And now for us, it's easy to accept this because we have watched a bunch of science fiction movies, and we know we've had astronauts in space. We've seen footage of them floating around. And true enough, if you have a droplet of water in outer space, it just hovers like in this very eerie way. It has nowhere to go. Where can it go? See? And that's very counterintuitive to us, and it's kind of spooky and eerie. Like if I just snap my fingers and you found yourself right now floating in the vacuum of outer space on the International Space Station, you would be really creeped out by that because it would be so different than what you've been used to your entire life. And yet, actually, that is the more true, more general way of looking at reality. Not this way that we live on the planet, because this is a very local portion of the universe which has an up and a down, but most of the universe does not have an up and a down. You see, so up and down are only relative to this context of being on this planet. So that's Anaximander, one of the earliest examples of relativity. And really, what I want to show you here is that mankind's greatest developments, scientifically, philosophically, and culturally over the last 2,000 years have often been discoveries, huge landmark discoveries of relativity. And each time one of these discoveries was made, it was made by some genius, brilliant visionary thinker, and then it was opposed by the majority of people who were not visionary genius thinkers. And then what happened is that after many centuries of debate and controversy and rejection, finally people came around and accepted the truth of relativity. So here's another example is with Copernicus. This is exactly what happened with Copernicus when he proposed that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. This was a brilliant bit of relativistic thinking, because at that point, the religious dogma and orthodoxy simply said that the planet must be at the center of the universe, and everything else revolves around the planet. Of course, this is a very self-centered, literally self-centered way of looking at the universe, and of course, that's part of the problem, is that every time that we're looking and making sense of the universe is that we're looking at it very self-centeredly. And so we have to kind of step outside of our own selfish agenda and selfish perspective to see how it really is. And so, of course, Copernicus proposed this idea that the sun was really more central than the Earth. And then later we found out that even the sun is not really the center of the universe, but just one out of millions of other suns that exist. And so that really dislocated us from taking any kind of central position within the universe. And this was opposed by the church, by the orthodoxy, even by many scientists at the time, because it certainly doesn't feel to us in our direct experience that the Earth is moving. See? It seems like everything else is moving. It seems like the stars are moving, planets around us are moving, the sun is moving, but the Earth is not moving. It's stationary from our point of view. But of course, if you went and stood on the moon, for example, it would feel the opposite. You would see the Earth rotating around. You would not see the moon rotating. To you, the moon would feel like it's at the center of the universe. You see? And that's the essence of relativity, is that it's very difficult to notice the relativity because you're enmeshed in the very thing that you're investigating. It's precisely because you're standing on the Earth that it's difficult for you to realize that the Earth is moving. See? it's precisely because you take a stance within your moral framework, whatever it is, that is difficult for you to see that your moral framework is relative. And then moving on through history, there was the discovery of the Americas with Columbus and other explorers. And just try to imagine how big of a relativistic shock this was to Europeans. Because, of course, Europeans had experienced other cultures like African culture and Islamic culture and even Far East Asian culture from the Orient and all that. But generally, European culture was sort of monolithic. And then imagine that somebody goes and discovers a whole new continent, a whole new set of continents, a whole new half of the planet that was basically missing from our maps and from our understanding, from our awareness. And think of what that must have been like during that time, to live through that. It must have been as radical as if we discovered that Mars was filled with aliens and life and plants, and we went over there and we started exploring it all. It would be crazy, unbelievable stuff that would be making the headline news every day, and it would really disturb our sense of reality, because the kind of things that you would find there, you'd find new types of human beings, practicing new types of religions, praying to new types of gods, consuming new types of food, riding different types of animals, having a totally different cuisine, different clothing, different weaponry, like so much different languages. Think of how unsettling that must have been, because your whole life you grew up as like a Catholic and you believed in a certain set of moral codes, and you believed that you should eat certain types of food and all this. And then let's say you take a ship and then you go over to the Americas, and there's like, you're in an alien world. See? And are you going to be open-minded enough to accept that their customs and their religion and their God that they pray to is no better than your own? That is just another one, an alternative one. Or are you going to insist that actually, well, yeah, Leo, I admit, of course, that there are people and plants and animals living on the new continent in the Americas, but my religion is the superior one. Of course, that's exactly what happened. And so there were religious wars and conquistadors and all of this, and missionary work trying to civilize the heathens and savages of the Americas. And then, of course, in retrospect, we look at that and we see how myopic and closed-minded that was, how ignorant that was. But this was just par for the course. This is how the human mind works. If you were alive in that time, you would have fallen prey to those same delusions and that closed-mindedness. Because, hey, when you grew up your whole life in Europe, you don't know anything else. You don't want to know anything else. You're scared of anything else. Because, if you have to go to the Americas and maybe seriously consider that their God might be more true than your God, you see, that relativizes your own religion on which your entire identity is based. That's very threatening. So, of course, you're not even going to want to study their God, because you just automatically assume that their God is bullshit. That's the problem with absolutism. That's also why relativism is so important, because if you take a relativistic perspective towards the whole world, then you don't get so wrapped up in your own personal dogmas and beliefs. Your mind opens, which allows you to explore reality more accurately than you could otherwise. During the same time, roughly speaking, Magellan circumnavigated the entire Earth. Actually, Magellan died before he succeeded in doing so, but his crew, many of whom also were killed, some of them succeeded in actually making it all the way around the Earth. It was a terrible journey, very gruesome, very actually interesting to read about it. I have a whole book about Magellan's journey on my book list. Check it out. Describes the whole ordeal. Eventually, Magellan was butchered in the Philippines. He was actually a really cruel and evil person, and he was butchered for it by the Filipino people, by the natives. Probably rightly deserved, because he tried to convert them all with his absolutistic Catholic stance. But anyways, I digress. my point about bringing up Magellan is that when his crew went around the whole Earth, they kept meticulous logs of every day of their whole journey. It took them years to circumnavigate the whole thing. Finally, when they got back to Europe, they realized that they were missing a day. And at first they thought, well, we must have kept our records wrong. But later they realized, no, actually, that's because what day it is relative to where you are on the planet. And actually, if you take an airplane and you fly all around the Earth, you're going to either gain a day or lose a day, depending on which direction you fly around in. It's kind of a weird counterintuitive result that you think couldn't happen, because you would think just common sense sort of just tells you that everyone on the planet is experiencing the same day. Like today is Friday. I'm shooting this on a Friday. So today is Friday, but not for everybody on the planet. It's Friday relative to me and people who live near me in my country. But on the other side of the Earth, it ain't Friday. It's already Saturday, or it's not even Friday yet. See, so it's relative. And then, of course, after all this exploration around the world started to happen, we had to invent a new system of time zones, Greenwich Mean Time, which means that, it's noon. The notion of what noon is relative, because it's noon at different times of the day for different people around the planet. Depends on your position around the Earth. So if it's noon here right now for me, it's not for many of you. It's the opposite of that. See, relativism. Noon is a relative notion. But for many people, you go back 2,000 years and try to convince somebody back then that noon is a relative notion. That would be a tough sell to most people. Now, some philosophers might understand because they understand the Earth is round, but your average person wouldn't understand this because their direct experience contradicts that. For them, noon is the same for all people. Leo, how come I'm able to meet my friend for lunch at noon if noon is relative? Well, of course you're able to meet your friend because you guys live so close to each other that you can't tell the little differences. But of course, if you're trying to coordinate lunch between you and someone who lives in Africa or in Asia, well, good luck doing that. You're not going to be able to do that with your simple absolutistic notions of what noon is. So this actually becomes very practical. This is not just philosophy. This affects how we live our lives. Think about also cultural and religious relativity, which sprawled during this time. Because as the planet globalized and communication and travel became easier, and people were able to not just live in one little town their whole life or little village, but are able to travel around and do tourism and all of this, you experience so many cultures and different religions that you start to really question which culture, which religion is the right one. It can be freaky. There's actually a phenomenon called culture shock, where you travel to a different culture and it's so radically foreign and alien and weird to you that it makes you question whether you almost feel like you're in some surreal dream when you travel to some far off country, because it's so different. The customs are so different. The norms are so different. The way people even say hello, or the way they bow to each other, or the way they eat their food, very simple little things. In Asia, they don't have forks, or they don't have table salt. These are just very things that you just take for granted as a European or as an American. It's so different there. Go to Japan and see what that's like. You're going to be in for some serious culture shock. See? So all of this makes you question your reality. You come back home and you start to wonder, hey, is it really right that we don't bow to each other? Why don't we bow? Maybe that's the better way to live life, is where people bow to each other. Or maybe you think it's the opposite. Certain cultures eat certain animals that other cultures would be horrified at eating, whether it's insects or cows or giraffes or whatever. See? All of that, I want you to understand, it's not merely that. It's oh yeah, it's kind of weird and alien, it's kind of doesn't feel comfortable. It goes way beyond that. really what's happening when you're experiencing these different cultures, cuisines, and religions and so forth. You're experiencing different perspectives, and you're actually coming face to face with the relativity of reality. And this is a threatening notion to you because your entire way of life and survival is based upon a certain environment that you've been living in. And it can be difficult to admit that survival is very different in different parts of the world. People survive in very different ways, you see? And then you come back home and you realize, like, wait a minute, what am I even doing? Why am I even going to this 9-to-5 job? Why am I even sitting in this cubicle, working for this person, doing the things that I'm doing? Why am I even going to school, right? It really makes you start to question not just your life, but if you take this deep enough, you'll actually start to question your reality. What's real? And that's when this stuff gets really serious. And of course, that's precisely why people are so against and so reactive to relativism, because they don't want to go down that slippery slope, because it's a slippery slope. And watch out, because you might slide off. You might slide off the entire world if you go deep enough. Think about the development of the U.S. Constitution. That was a radical achievement for mankind because it guaranteed religious pluralism, freedom of religion. Nowadays we think, oh, well, what's the big deal? That's so obvious. It wasn't obvious back then. It wasn't obvious when 99% of people were absolutists and they were either Catholics or Protestants, and that's all they were, and they knew that they were right and everybody else was wrong. It was extremely counterintuitive to create a new society and enshrine into its very fabric freedom of religion, because this opened the floodgates to relativity. And back then, people were theocrats. The governments of that time, they were ruled by some pope or some divinely anointed monarch who justified his rule because he was some son of God, or even literally God himself, or came from some divine lineage like the Egyptian pharaohs and so forth. And so there was no possibility of another religion. This was crazy. This was insanity to say that there could be two religions and that they could both be equally right. This was insane. See? But nowadays, this is rather normal. Now, of course, many people still reject this. A lot of people actually, and especially what's ironic about it is that many conservatives and right-wingers, if they're religiously oriented, then they tend to be absolutistic about their religion. And so even though they defend the Constitution and they say that they love the Second Amendment and they love the free speech and all of this, and they want to preserve that as traditionalists, but actually they don't understand religious pluralism that the Constitution enshrined. They actually want a theocracy. They want America to be a Christian nation, a Judeo-Christian nation. And then they come up with arguments for why it was that way at the founding, right? Because they don't understand the value of religious pluralism. And even if they do, even if they admit and they say, well, Leo, okay, fine, let's allow the Muslims to go to their mosques, and let's allow the Hindus to do their Hindu stuff. But Leo, I mean, they're still deluded. Everybody knows Christianity is the one true one. So we're only allowing those other people to believe what they want to believe simply because we just want to like humor them and we don't want to piss them off. But really, we all know that Judeo-Christian values are the right ones, right? You see, it still hasn't sunk in what religious pluralism and relativity really means. When you really understand that your own religion is not absolute. This is a huge paradigm shift for human beings in their cognitive development. This is where you shift from spiral dynamic stage blue to orange. And the Constitution was a stage orange revolutionary invention. It wasn't a stage blue invention, the way that theocrats and fundamentalists and evangelicals sometimes want it to be. It was a very radical evolutionary development at that time. And many people opposed it. because they were absolutists. A little bit later in our history, we have the development of Euclidean geometry, or actually maybe it was roughly around the same time as the Constitution was written. Roughly speaking, non-Euclidean geometry was discovered by Carl Gauss and others at that time. And what they discovered is, of course, that the classical geometry of Euclid from ancient Greece, as brilliant as it was, Euclid outlined all the postulates and axioms of geometry, and he was very rigorous in outlining all of these. And it was just assumed that geometry was done, set in stone. Geometry just is absolute. Until, of course, we started questioning it a little bit further, and we realized that all of Euclid's proofs and axioms and conclusions, they're all true relative to a flat plane. But on a sphere, it ain't true anymore. On some saddle-shaped surface, it ain't true. If we're talking about a 4 or 5 or 10-dimensional geometric object, it doesn't behave according to Euclid's postulates and ideas. So entirely new geometries had to be invented, and that led to huge scientific and philosophical revolutions. And then, of course, a little bit later, in the early 20th century, we had the development of quantum mechanics. And this was a huge relativistic breakthrough. Many people still don't understand the significance of quantum mechanics and what it really means as far as relativity goes. So the reason that quantum mechanics was relativistic was because what it showed is that measurement is not an absolute, but that measurement is entangled with the actual measuring instrument. So before quantum mechanics, what we assumed is that if I just take some physical object and I start measuring it, I'm measuring the actual physical object, and there it is, and my measurements are just objectively true. But what happened was when you started to bore deeper and deeper and deeper into reality itself, the very guts and fabric of it, you started to reach the point where it became impossible to distinguish the measuring instrument that you're using and the thing that you're measuring, and that they are actually at all times entangled, because you cannot divide the subject from the object. You're not some impartial observer. So when you're taking a microscope and you're looking at some molecule in that microscope, the actual photons of the microscope are affecting the molecule you're looking at, and it's changing your measurement. So you can never say how an object actually is. What you must say is, you must say, this is how object X appears when viewed through method or object Y. And there is no such thing as a particle. A particle is something you see when you look at an object a certain way. So it's not that there's a particle over here and then some measuring instrument over here. No. What a particle is entangled with any measuring instrument that you're using, which is what generates the particle. Otherwise, what you have is you just have sort of a quantum soup, an indefinite, indistinct quantum soup, a sort of infinity from which the particle must be drawn out using some method of observation. So this was very counterintuitive, spooky, and paradoxical, and a lot of people didn't want to accept it. A lot of people still don't want to accept it. A lot of scientists still don't accept this. Even quantum physicists who are working in advanced universities today still do not accept the epistemic and metaphysical implications. Sure, they accept the results, but they don't like the lab results. They accept that, but they don't accept the metaphysical and epistemic implications of what I'm saying here, and of what the early founding fathers of quantum mechanics realized, what Niels Bohr and others like him realized. And if you want some more details on that, I have a multi-part series, 2-part series called Quantum Mechanics Debunks Materialism, where we go into this in a lot of depth, and I actually dissect and give you quotations. It's very in-depth, so go check that out if you're really interested. A lot of people still argue with me, tell me that I don't understand quantum mechanics because that I'm presenting it in a relativistic fashion, and that in fact, Leo, quantum mechanics never really demonstrated relativism. That's simply because you don't really understand the metaphysics and the epistemology of quantum. You haven't thought about it deeply enough yet. It's extremely radical stuff. And even though some scientists do understand it, by and large, the implications, the metaphysical and epistemic implications of quantum mechanics have not percolated through into mainstream culture. People still generally believe that the world is made of particles, that particles exist independently of humans and measuring instruments, and that we can just talk about particles. You can't just talk about particles. This has been debunked for over 100 years. Yet most people go around and keep talking this way. Why is that? Because it makes no practical difference within the very limited context that they're living in. But actually, it does make a practical difference. You're just not aware of how. The way it makes a practical difference is that it solidifies your worldview into some materialistic worldview, some sort of absolutistic worldview. And this actually affects your ability to investigate reality and to discover who you are and to self-actualize, which is why we're talking about this. All this connects directly back to your own personal development. You're not able to go deep enough in personal development unless you understand relativity, because you get stuck in some absolutist worldview perspective. Like you start to believe that you are a physical body. And you never question that. It never occurs to you that that could be a relativistic notion. But we're getting there. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Continuing on with the history, of course, we had soon after quantum mechanics, or even roughly at the same time, Einstein's general relativity, where Einstein showed and proved, and this was borne out by many different experiments, that time, space, motion, and length are all relative. So literally, like I said with that Eiffel Tower example, the length of an object depends on your speed and your frame of reference to that object. There is no such thing as absolute space in the way that Isaac Newton thought. There is no absolute motion. Think about how significant this is. People still don't understand how significant and how radical Einstein's discoveries were. Sometimes people argue and they say, well, Leo, relativism, what are you talking about? Relativism, good and bad. Morality can't be relative, man. But even time and space and distance and length and motion have already been proven to be relative for over 100 years. This has been demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt. And yet you still cling to some absolutist version of your culture as being superior, or your religion as being superior, or your morality, your notion of good and bad as being absolute. Like, you're not thinking about this at all, are you? Time does not exist. Space, motion, distance does not exist. But see, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because in your everyday experience, which is the thing that drives your whole worldview, it doesn't matter. You don't care about the truth. You don't care about what's real. You don't care about facts. What you care about is your perspective and how it allows you to survive. That's what you care about. You care about your ego. And your entire sense of physics and reality is completely serving your survival. You get this? Almost nobody gets this. Even scientists who should know better, they still don't get it. They get it theoretically, but they don't actually get it in their own life. They don't get how significant it is. They haven't allowed this knowledge to really transform their everyday consciousness. So in this sense, science is very stuck even still today. People are in denial about it. And notice that all throughout history, the name of the game is denial. Every time some new relativistic development happens, whether it's the discovery of the Americas or non-Euclidean geometry, there's always a large contingent of people which deny it, demonize it, attack it, reject it, ridicule it, and even harm and violently attack those people who are putting forth these discoveries. Right, because your worldview is at stake. And not just your worldview, but your very life is at stake. Because your life and your worldview are inseparable. You and your worldview are inseparable. You are your worldview. You don't just have a worldview, you are your worldview. I want to read you a quote from Leonard Susskind, who is a modern, world-renowned scientist who understands relativity and, of course, quantum mechanics. He said, quote, Einstein, in the special theory of relativity, proved that different observers in different states of motion see different realities. End quote. Yeah. Do you understand the significance of that quote? That's a huge thing to admit. A huge thing to admit. And by the way, even though Leonard Susskind is a great scientist otherwise, and of course understands many of these things, and he said this quote, he still doesn't understand the full extent of relativity. That's how deep this stuff goes. So be very, very careful. All right, be very, very careful. I want to warn you about thinking of relativity in overly simplistic terms. It's very easy to straw man relativity. It's very easy to come up with some childish notion of relativity, which then just, breaks apart upon just considering a few examples. Relativity is very twisted and complicated, and it's not easy to understand, and it's not easy to explain, and you're not going to understand it simply by listening to me talk for a couple of hours. This is a good start, but you're very far from really understanding what relativity truly means. So let's keep going. Let's complete our history here. Around the same time as quantum mechanics and general relativity, there was also the discovery of multiple different types of logic. For millennia and for centuries, it was assumed that Aristotelian logic is the only kind of logic. It's a very binary, linear form of logic. And then it was discovered that actually there are an infinite number of different types of logic. So, of course, that relativized logic. There was no longer one true logic. There was also the development of Quine's ontological relativism, roughly around the same time as Einstein, a philosopher, analytic Western philosopher by the name of Willard Quine, who I talked about in the past in some of my epistemic-oriented episodes. He came up with several papers which outlined and explained ontological relativism. Literally, what he said is that if you have two human beings from radically different cultures trying to communicate with each other, or let's say a human and an alien, and we're trying to communicate with each other, our language and our worldview is so entangled with our ontology and what we think of as our physics that it becomes inseparable and it becomes impossible to actually discover what the ontology of the other person is without fully becoming that person. Because our language is infested with ontological assumptions. And so when an animal is running by, let's say, you can point to that animal and you could say, well, that's a cat. And you might say, well, but that alien can also point to the animal and also say, well, that's a cat. And so we can agree on that. I might say cat, the alien might say boop. That's the word he uses, let's say, for cat. And by by that, we both mean cat. So Leo, what's the problem? I mean, we can agree on this stuff. This is not complicated. But actually, it doesn't work this way. What Quine showed is that it's much more twisted, because how are you going to determine what boop refers to within the alien's paradigm? Just because he points at that thing that you call a cat and says boop does not mean that you can say that he has the same notion of a cat as you do. Because for you, when you point at it and you say cat, you mean, well, it's this creature with 4 legs and it's running, it's got a tail, it's got fur, it's got all this sorts of stuff, and it's an object and it exists. That's what you mean by cat. But to him, when he points at it and he says boop, what he might mean is the motion of fur through space, for example. So you might be thinking of that cat as an object that exists permanently within space. The alien might be thinking of that cat as a verb, for example, as fur through space, as a process, not as an object. And that's a significant metaphysical ontological difference. And what Quine basically showed is that there's never going to be a way for you two to reconcile that and to fully understand each other. The only way you can really understand what this alien means is if you grew up in his culture and learned all of the norms and ways in which these aliens think about cats and animals in the world. And so in this sense, literally, we've got a version of ontological relativism where the actual physicality of things changes. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, there was an enormous development within science based on the work of Thomas Kuhn, who came up with the notion of a paradigm. I've talked about this in my episode called, I believe it's called How Paradigms Work. Google Actualized.org paradigms, and you'll find it. It's a very important video where I talk about Thomas Kuhn's work. And basically what he discovered from studying the history of science is he discovered that science, the way it works, is it works through paradigms. There is no such thing as one objective science. There are different paradigms within science, different competing worldviews, so to speak. These paradigms are actually ontologically different and epistemically different. They're just like different worldviews, different ways of looking at the world and doing science in different ways. And so there's always competing paradigms within science happening at all times. And there's always like a prevailing paradigm, and those paradigms need to be subverted and then challenged, and then new paradigms are introduced. And so this is a whole process by which science evolves. It's much more messy and complicated than people think. And it's much more relativistic. And in fact, Thomas Kuhn introduced the notion of what's called incommensurability, which means that if I have my worldview and you have your worldview, we're never going to be able to fully reconcile our two worldviews, which is just sort of basically what I was explaining with the cat example. It's like that. Now, of course, Thomas Kuhn later was shocked that his work was used in order to defend various radical versions of relativism, and he distanced himself from that. But actually, Thomas Kuhn did not understand his own discovery of paradigms. He didn't understand how radical paradigms really are. He didn't fully understand what relativism is. And so in this sense, he rejected it prematurely. That's because that's how tricky this stuff is, right? So world-class philosophers and scientists and thinkers and intellectuals, they still misunderstand this stuff. So again, be very, very, very careful here. So literally what Thomas Kuhn was saying was that depending on which scientific paradigm you're using to look at a problem and at the world, he wasn't just saying that we have different worldviews. He was actually saying that the things out of which the world is made actually change when a scientific paradigm changes. That's pretty radical. And a lot of scientists, they don't want to admit this because they believe in a material, objective, external world that's independent of them. But as quantum mechanics showed, there is no such a world. You're always interfacing with the world. So really, there isn't a world and a scientist. or a world and a worldview, the scientist is the world. The worldview is the world. Then relativism went full bore in the second half of the 20th century with developments within linguistics, structuralism, post-structuralism, and postmodernism. This is a deep topic that I don't have time to get into. I have an older episode about Jacques Derrida and deconstruction and about postmodernism and about language. Go check it out. It's a pretty good episode, very in-depth about what postmodernism is about. And I'll be talking more about postmodernism in the future and various limitations of postmodernism. But basically what happened was in the late 20th century, relativity became so obvious to academics because the world became so globalized and so interconnected that we could no longer seriously, as an academic, you could no longer seriously maintain that one culture was superior to some other culture, or that one worldview was superior to all other worldviews. It just became untenable for social scientists to think this way. They had to adopt a position of relativism. And then, of course, that was easier to do in the social sciences, in the softer sciences, in the humanities than it was in the hard physical sciences. So a lot of hard physical scientists still rigidly cling to a materialist, reductionistic worldview where they insist that everything can be just boiled down to hard physics and to particles. But as we've seen, there are no such thing as particles. So what are you boiling it down to? You can't even do that. You can't even do that. And then there was, of course, relativism acknowledged within sexuality and within gender, which is what we're seeing now. And of course, a lot of people react against this negatively. Traditionally oriented people, they react very negatively when you tell them that sexuality or gender is relativistic. They don't want to admit that male and female is relative. They don't want to admit that homosexuality is just as normal and is just as natural as heterosexuality, and that there's different things even just beyond male and female and all of this, right? So this is all this is all sort of the history of relativism. And of course, there's many examples I'm leaving out because it's long enough as it is. But what we can see here is that really the 20th century, the last century, was the century of relativism. There were so many relativistic discoveries within quantum mechanics, logic, linguistics, philosophy, history of science, the humanities, the social sciences. Like, man, you had the psychedelic revolution, which just poured gasoline on top of all that. Sexual relativism, gender relativism, religious relativism. Wow, it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. So sometimes conservatives rail against academics and colleges and universities for teaching relativism and that this is destroying the fabric of society, the good old Christian values. Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. Relativism is like acid, hydrochloric acid poured upon one's worldview. It's deconstructive, destructive, and people, of course, react very negatively against this. But what you discover, the deeper you study reality, is that more and more of the stuff you thought was absolute, you discover is actually relative. And this is very unnerving. And of course, this is why universities have led these relativistic revolutions and movements. And they are a force, they are a cultural force which is relativizing culture, which a lot of people find frightening and threatening. But it has to happen in universities because universities are sort of at the forefront of human knowledge, and they are dealing with like the cutting edge of discovering new stuff, the cutting edge of science, the cutting edge of understanding. And so for them, it's untenable to take an absolutist position really on anything because you will simply be proven wrong, and eventually you're going to lose your professorship if you take an absolutist position because eventually your ideas and theories will simply be debunked or disproven. You won't be able to write good research papers. You need to be very careful and relativistic as an academic. You need to qualify everything you say. You got to confine it within a context. You can't just say that such and such is true absolutely. You got to say it's true in such and such a situation under such and such conditions when measured in such and such a way to such and such people from such and such a perspective. This would be a very nuanced academic way of conveying a truth. And even then, that often doesn't go far enough. So relativism is necessary to explain the diversity of perspectives, cultures, social norms, epistemic schemes, and ontologies and paradigms that are found throughout human history and all around the world. So relativism is inevitable. You can't keep this thing bottled up because it's actually coming deep from within science. Science, in a way, is actually undermining itself because science began as a sort of absolutistic project. But then the more and more you did science, the more you discover that, no, this isn't right. It doesn't hold. Our experiments don't support this. Whether it's experiments within quantum mechanics or within cosmology or within astrophysics or within biology or sociology or psychology, anthropology, history, it doesn't hold. And Western culture has been very absolutistic for 2,000 years. And then, that dam was slowly eroded until now it's starting to burst. And of course, with that come a lot of challenges. But now let's contrast it. That was all Western tradition. Now let's contrast that with Eastern culture. In the East, actually, they were not absolutistic for as long as the West. Relativism was an important feature of Eastern philosophy for a very long time, for thousands of years. In fact, I want to introduce you to one very important piece of that, which is the concept of anekantavada. It's a bit of a long word, anekantavada. It's the Jain notion of many-sidedness, and I love this notion. This is such a powerful concept. I almost wish I could shoot a video just on this notion alone. Literally, it means no one perspectivism. No one perspectivism. That's anekantavada. And I want to now quote to you what this means from Wikipedia. It says, quote, "The origins of anekantavada are traceable to the teachings of Mahavira, who used it effectively to show the relativity of truth and reality." Let me pause there. Mahavira was an early enlightened sage. I think he actually predated the Buddha, but just think of him as basically as another Buddha. So, going on, quote, "According to Jainism," and of course Jainism was founded upon Mahavira's teachings, "no single specific statement can describe the nature of existence and the absolute truth. All knowledge claims must be qualified in many ways, including being affirmed and denied. Reality can be experienced, but it is not possible to totally express it with language. Human attempts to communicate is called Naya," the word Naya, which translates as partial expression of truth. Language is not the truth with a capital T, but it's a means and an attempt to express truth. Spiritual truths are complex, they have multiple aspects, language cannot express their plurality, and yet, through effort and appropriate karma, they can be experienced. No philosophic or metaphysical proposition can be true if it is asserted without a condition or limitation. All knowledge claims must be qualified in many ways because reality is many-sided." And it goes on to say, quote, "All of the following 7 predicates must be accepted as true for a cooking pot." So imagine an ordinary household cooking pot. Usually we would say, well, that's just a physical object. It's obvious what it is. So what can be relativistic about it? Well, here's how Jainism and Mahavira would look at it. They would say, firstly, quote, "From a certain point of view, it can be said that the pot exists. From a certain point of view, the pot does not exist. From a certain point of view, the pot both exists and does not exist. From a certain point of view, the pot is inexpressible. From a certain point of view, the pot both exists and is inexpressible. From a certain point of view, the pot both does not exist and is inexpressible. And finally, from a certain point of view, the pot exists, the pot does not exist, and also it's inexpressible. End quote. I absolutely love this. To me, this notion of Anekantavada is one of the most important notions in your entire attempt to understand reality. And there's a reason for that, of course. And the reason that Mahavira understood this is because he was enlightened. And that's really the only time that you'll fully appreciate what relativity means, is when you become enlightened. But nevertheless, you got to start somewhere, so let's start here. Can you see how Anekantavada works? Can you see how important it is? And can you see how different it is from the way that most people treat life? Most people in life, what are they doing? They're debating, they're arguing, they're trying to advance their position. They take absolutist stances, and they say, no, reality is this way. And then somebody else says, no, it's that way. And then they argue and they debate, whether it's science or morality or ethics or even spirituality. This happens. What people don't see is the meta point. The meta point is when you zoom up from all that and you look upon what's really going on. Why do people have such radically different perspectives of the world? Like, totally different. Not just a little bit different, totally different. How is this possible? And the ultimate answer is Anekantavada. Many-sidedness, because the nature of reality itself is that it's perspectival and relativistic. It's not one way, as we tend to assume. Of course, the other great contribution from Hinduism and perhaps from Jainism is the parable of the 5 blind men and the elephant, which is a really beautiful metaphor for explaining a lot of conflict and contradiction between different human paradigms. This is an ancient story from India, which basically goes like this. There were 5 blind men and 1 giant elephant, and they all were feeling it. One blind man was feeling the tail, another one was feeling the leg, another was feeling the side, another was feeling the ear, another was feeling the snout. And each one started to explain what an elephant is to the other ones. And they all started to explain it from their own direct experience. So the one holding and feeling the tail, he said it's like a rope. The one feeling the leg, he said it's like a tree trunk. The one feeling the side says it's like a wall. The one feeling the ear said it's like a curtain. The one feeling the snout said that it's like a snake. And then they all started arguing and fighting with each other, and they could never agree about what an elephant is. And of course, the elephant in this case represents reality itself. And each blind man represents just a person. And so every time we start to have a conversation about what reality is, every one of us, because we're only experiencing a tiny, tiny portion of the whole, because reality is so huge and vast, and actually, it's literally infinite. Because reality is literally infinite, you never have the whole. Even if you did have the whole, you couldn't communicate the whole because the whole is the whole. How do you communicate the whole to the part? You see? And so this becomes a very deep epistemic problem. How do we teach and discuss what reality is when each one of us is like one of these blind men feeling this giant elephant? And this, in a nutshell, explains so much. It's such a simple metaphor, but it explains so many deep problems that you see within life. It helps you make sense of reality so much. That's why I love these concepts of Anekantavada and this parable of the elephant and the blind man. Because what you got to understand is that each side of a debate is always part right, part wrong, and also always incomplete. To every metaphysical question, there are many right answers reflecting many facets and degrees of the one absolute truth, which is the whole of reality. The absolute truth is the whole of reality. It's the elephant. So the elephant is there. But what the elephant is the sum total of all the views. And so really the blind men, they're not really separate from the elephant. They are part of the elephant. So really, maybe even a better metaphor would be that like the elephant's tail was trying to communicate with the elephant's leg, was trying to communicate with the elephant's ear and its snout, and each part would try to argue with each other and fight with each other and tear itself apart. The elephant would just literally kill itself, tearing itself apart, not understanding itself. One part trying to outdo the other parts without realizing that it just is the entire thing. See? Made out of different parts. So that's why this stuff is so tricky. And of course, specifically, this metaphor explains why there's so much controversy within spirituality, within religion, and even within non-duality, even within Buddhism. Even if you take one sect of Buddhism, you'll discover so many differing perspectives and worldviews on that sect of Buddhism. People still don't agree. Have you ever wondered why this is the case? Have you noticed this is a deep, universal problem across all human endeavors, is that people disagree with each other so much and they hold different worldviews. Even if people have the same worldview, they still disagree with each other because in the end, their worldviews might be similar, but they're not identical. So who's right and who's wrong? Well, the mistake is thinking that one of them is right and the rest of them are wrong. That's the mistake. The correct way to look at it is that each one of them is pointing out some part of reality, misunderstanding it deeply, and then reporting it in an incomplete fashion. And that's why we have this crazy mess. And it's so difficult to understand reality. Going on, I have another quote for you. This one is now from Paul Boghossian. And he says, quote, "The relativist about a given domain D purports to have discovered the truths of D involve an unexpected relation to a parameter," end quote. So, for example, it is wrong to enslave people. We might say that. And many people would look at that and say, okay, that's true. That's true. But actually, it's not true. It is wrong to enslave people relative to 21st century norms. That's more true. Because what's also true is that it's okay to enslave people relative to ancient Roman norms. So who was correct? Are we correct in the 21st century or were the ancient Romans correct? The mistake people make is they say, well, clearly ancient Romans were unevolved and they were barbarians, and we've had time to think it through. And Leo, we finally come to the true conclusion, which is that everyone knows that slavery is actually wrong. That's incorrect. Not everyone knows that. And even if everyone agrees with you, even if you took a poll of the entire planet and 7 billion people agreed with you that slavery is wrong, the reality is that all that you really have is you have a consensus of 7 billion people in the 21st century saying that slavery is wrong. That doesn't actually make it wrong. That just means that that's what it is. That's what people think. That happens to be the current situation. Who knows what it'll be like in 3,000 years? You don't know. You don't know. This, of course, offends and threatens many people because slavery is a nasty business, and people want slavery to be objectively wrong. Now, of course, don't misunderstand me, and please don't get offended. I'm not saying that we should bring back slavery, nor am I in favor of racism. Nor nor am I making arguments for some sort of white nationalism or anything like this. We're just trying to accurately understand what it really means to say that something is wrong or to say that something is true. To not understand this simply because you're offended by it or because it threatens you, I mean, I understand where you're coming from. As part of your survival agenda is to look out and not to get enslaved, and that's fine. And I support a government that doesn't enslave people, but it's relativistic. See, it's wrong precisely because you are the one who might be enslaved. That's precisely why you want to say that it's wrong. It's wrong relative to you. Why is slavery bad? Because it makes you feel bad. If slavery made you feel good, it would be right, according to you. You see? So it's relative to your emotional system. It's not wrong in any absolute sense. It's wrong in the sense that it creates a lot of suffering for people. So relative to that, it's not good. Then again, still, furthermore, it's only wrong if you don't want to suffer. You see, you're assuming that everyone doesn't want to suffer. But again, you have to go deeper and you have to ask, well, is suffering really wrong? What's wrong with suffering? Most people never get to question this deeply, of course. Of course, there is nothing wrong with suffering. And you could even imagine a scenario in which someone who wants to suffer, for him, being a slave is right. Now, of course, you're not going to find many of these people, but again, there's a deeper point here that's being made. There's a deeper metaphysical epistemic point that's being made. There is no truth of the matter of whether it is wrong to sell people as slaves, independently of one's frame of reference. As harsh as that sounds, as heartless as that might sound to you, it's true. And it's actually very important that you understand why it's true. Otherwise, you're going to be deluded in how you think about reality, and you better understand that it's going to affect how you live your life. For the worse, you're actually going to suffer by not understanding this. So, here's one lesson I want you to take away from this episode, is that I want you to get very good at asking the question, what is the frame of reference here? What is the frame of reference here? So usually what happens is that when human beings are discussing something or they're trying to understand something, they forget the frame of reference. It's almost always ignored. It's almost always taken for granted in debates and discussions and even within scientific inquiry. This creates a false sense of absolutism and solidity. So for example, from now on, if you understand relativity, I want you to think this way. If someone comes to you and says, so-and-so is bad, I want you to ask the question, from what frame of reference? If someone says to you, so-and-so is crazy, I want you to ask them, from what frame of reference? What's your frame of reference? If someone says, so-and-so is true or such and such is false, I want you to ask, from what frame of reference? And find the reference frame, make it explicit. Do it about your own views as well. So like if you believe that Hitler is evil, ask yourself, what's my frame of reference? If you believe slavery is bad, ask yourself, what's my frame of reference? And what you'll discover is that, oh yeah, my frame of reference is that I am assuming that suffering is bad. Okay, is that true? Could suffering be good? Again, what's my frame of reference for assuming that suffering is bad? Well, because I don't like to feel bad. I don't like the feeling of suffering. But then question that further, what's the frame of reference? Is it true that the feeling of suffering is actually bad? And you might reach a point where you actually discover that suffering isn't objectively bad. It's only bad relative to you. Because, of course, suffering is a subjective mechanism that your mind uses to help you to survive. Now you might say, oh, Leo, but I got to survive. Survival is good. Question that as well. What's your frame of reference to say that survival is good or that it's even necessary? And so on. You get the idea. And also, when you hear people talking sloppily, I want you to translate what they're really saying, translate what they're saying into what they really mean. So for example, if someone says, the following is true, what they actually mean, translate that, what they actually mean is, the following is true relative to blank. And if someone says, the following is rational, it's not actually rational. What they mean is, it's rational relative to blank. Or someone says, so-and-so is good. Actually, what that means is, so-and-so is good relative to blank. Or someone says, the following thing is meaningful. What they actually mean is, it's meaningful relative to who? Or relative to what? And when someone says, so-and-so is real, such and such is real, what they really mean is, such and such is real relative to blank. For example, we're sitting here right now. I'm sitting here. You're sitting over there. We're having this discussion. This seems like it's real. It's real relative to dreaming. But, for example, you take some psychedelics, or you have a samadhi experience or an awakening experience, and you realize that actually this, what we call reality, this here, it was only real relative to dreams. But you go one step higher, you realize that this itself is a dream, you awaken from it, and you realize like, oh, that wasn't real. This thing we call real isn't real. Awakening is real. That's what's really real. This thing here, this was just a dream. See? In that case, what you did is you discovered the hidden, unconscious frame of reference that was there. It was laying there the whole time, but you weren't aware of it. And that's what you discover when you start to do some serious consciousness work. So, science is not better than witchcraft. Monogamy is not better than polygamy. Buddhism is not better than Islam. Logic is not better than emotions. Meditation is not better than psychedelics. Each has its unique pros and cons. This is difficult for many people to accept. Also, make sure you don't make the mistake, the common mistake, of thinking that what I'm doing here is I'm setting up false equivalencies between, for example, science and witchcraft. So, listen to carefully to what I'm saying here. Science is not better than witchcraft. That is true. But this does not mean that science and witchcraft are equally suitable for any given situation or goal. So, for example, if you want to send a man to the moon, science is better than witchcraft relative to that objective. If, on the other hand, for example, you want to do some deep soul searching and you want to visit the astral spirit realms, science is terrible for that. You better use witchcraft or something along those lines to do that. Witchcraft usually involves various psychedelic herbs that are used, potions and ointments and so forth. Those can actually be effective for sending you to the astral realm and doing shadow work and facing your own inner demons and spiritually growing yourself. Science is not very effective for that. See? So they have pros and cons. And so this requires care here. I'm not saying that science is equivalent to witchcraft. And I'm not saying that Buddhism is equivalent to Islam. It's just not better, is what I'm saying. And I'm saying it has unique pros and cons. You might say, oh, Leo, but Buddhism is less violent than Islam. Buddhism is a more true religion. It's easier to achieve enlightenment through Buddhism. But again, that assumes that enlightenment is your highest goal. That's a relative matter. There's no reason why you should want enlightenment over something else. Maybe what you want is you want to pray and worship Allah, in which case Islam is, of course, obviously the preferred way. Also, you have to understand that it's relative to context and environment. So, for example, if you're living in the Middle East, then even though Buddhism might technically be, let's say, better for achieving enlightenment, maybe it has better techniques or so you might think. If you're living in the Middle East and you have to consider other factors like political factors, family ties, friendships that you have, these are all important to you. So in this sense, you might actually convert to Islam simply because you're going to fit better into your culture. Whereas if you were going to be a Buddhist in the Middle East in certain areas, that might actually be threatening to your life. Go try being a Buddhist in Saudi Arabia. It's not going to work out so well for you. You ain't going to get enlightened. You're going to get your head chopped off. See? So you might say, oh, Leo, but isn't that proof that Buddhism is better? Because look, in Saudi Arabia, the Muslims, they'll chop your head off. The Buddhists don't do that. Again, it's all relative. Depends on what you want. Do you care about getting your head chopped off? That's your frame of reference. You don't have to care. Just because it's your survival, just because it's your ass, doesn't mean that now it's the truth. It just means it's your ass. So be careful about that sort of self-centered way of looking at the world. Another way of thinking about relativity, which I really like, is as follows. Reality can't tell which way is up or down. Reality can't tell which object is big or small. Reality can't tell the speed at which an object is moving at. Reality can't tell the difference between an inch and a mile. Reality can't tell what time it is right now. Reality can't tell you what the XYZ coordinates of an object are. And reality can't tell if Hitler is a bad person. Reality doesn't know these things. You, as a human, can know these things. And by knowing them, you don't find them in the outer world, you actually create them. A lot of scientifically minded people, mathematically minded people, they somehow assume that every object in the universe has an XYZ coordinate. Of course, this is painfully absurd. This is a human projection. Objects in the universe do not have an XYZ coordinate. God, so to speak, does not know the XYZ coordinates of my body right now. There is no such thing, because this is a relative notion that had to be constructed by humans. Likewise, God does not know what time it is right now. And I'm not saying that you should believe in God. I'm just using that as a sort of a metaphor for taking the universal perspective. This is what you have to do, stepping outside of your perspective to take the universal perspective. Likewise, God can't tell the difference whether Hitler is a good or bad person. You can. Now, here's the trick. Here's the wrinkle, is that you are part of reality. So reality actually can tell that Hitler is a bad person, but only through you. You see? So when you judge Hitler to be a bad person, that is reality determining at that very moment that Hitler is a bad person. Now, of course, you have to understand that some other person might determine that Hitler is a good person. So there's going to be your determination as reality, determining Hitler's bad, and then reality will determine that Hitler is good. Like a neo-Nazi would probably think Hitler is good. So who is right? You might say, well, of course I'm right. But of course, that's only from your perspective. If you realize that you weren't just this part of reality, but also this part of reality and all parts of reality, because reality is one, if you realized you were the whole elephant, then you would realize that neither one is right. All of it just is a perspective, and all of that is what reality is. That is the whole elephant. And this is what gets you a sort of a meta perspective and a distance from your personal little judgments of Hitler or anybody else. Get that? Again, I'm not saying that Well, actually, I sort of am, but this is too controversial to say. I'm not saying that Hitler is good. What I'm saying is that it's undefined. Hitler is neither good or bad. But also, using that principle of anakantivada, we also have to say that to be totally rigorous, we have to say Hitler is neither good nor bad. Hitler is undefined. Hitler is good because some people think he's good. Hitler is also bad because many people think he's bad. And so Hitler is both good and bad. And all of that at the same time, and also none of it at the same time. And beyond all of that, Hitler transcends all of that at the same time as well. That's anakantivada. And that's as close to the truth as you're going to get within language, within thought, within concepts. You can go beyond all of that, but now we're getting into a realm we're going into samadhi now, and then that's beyond anything that can be spoken or communicated, so I can't teach it to you. That would be the actual absolute. So, what kinds of things are relative? I got a list for you. All aesthetics, tastes, and opinions, of course, should be obvious enough, right? All beliefs and all worldviews. Science and mathematics. And that's a difficult one for people to swallow. But all scientific models and descriptions are relative. All scales and measurements are relative. Counting and units are relative. So this is why mathematics is relative, you see. Because what counts as 1 or as 2 or as 3 or as 4 or as 5, whatever, is relative. Is this 1 object or is this 5 objects? It depends on how you count it. See, you could look at the hand as being 1, or you could look at it as five things. But it's actually, both are sort of true at the same time. The hand is 1, but also it's got 5 parts to it. But of course, how many parts does it really have? Well, I mean, it's got billions of cells. So is this hand really 1? Is it 5, or is it a billion cells? It's all of that, and it's none of that, and it's beyond all of that as well. Because, of course, it's got molecules in there, and atoms, and quarks, and how many quarks are in here? Trillions upon trillions and trillions. So how many is this hand? This hand is actually infinite. It goes on forever. There's an infinite number of structure to this hand. It has no end. It has no bottom. It has no beginning. And it has no end. Of course, continuing on with the list, patterns within nature and significant relationships that you pull out of nature. So if you say that X is related to Y, which is a lot of what science does. Science is basically just finding patterns and relationships within nature. Every relationship you find is relative. Every pattern you find is relative. It's just a question of which patterns will you focus on. And of course, the patterns you focus on are the ones that help you to build the worldview that will help you to survive. So see, all of science is very selfish in this sense. Rationality and logic are relative. All analysis and critique is relative. Knowledge, all knowledge and understanding is relative. All language, symbols, thoughts, and concepts are relative. All paradigms, models, theories, and epistemologies are relative. All physical objects, and what counts as a physical object. To even say that this is a hand, that's relative. Perception, all perception is relative. All of history is relative. All culture is relative. Survival, of course, is relative. Go check out my 2-part series called Understanding Survival, where we talk about the relativity of survival in a lot of detail. Meaning, significance, value, purpose, and goals, and motivations. These are all relative. Morality, ethics, norms, right and wrong, and good and bad. These are all relative. All judgments are relative. All religions are relative. All spiritual teachings and explanations, including all of my own, are relative. Justice, law, criminality, and good government. What counts as good government? This is relative. So there's no such thing as an absolutely good government. There's good government relative to what your survival needs are. What's good government to one person will be terrible government to another person because they have different survival needs. Of course, this is why creating a good government is so notoriously difficult and so contentious. What counts as the best is, of course, relative. All problems are relative. Health is relative. Success and failure are relative. Happiness, suffering, difficulty, pain, and pleasure are relative. Sanity and insanity are relative. Birth, now here's where it gets really tricky. Your own birth, life, and death, and sense of self are relative, and your notion of other human beings is relative. The drawing of all categories is relative, and all dualities are relative, as I discussed in my 3-part series called Understanding Duality. So what's left? What isn't relative? That's exactly the point. See, that's exactly the point. So let's take a quick intermission, and then we'll come back and talk about objections to relativism. Okay, let's talk about some common objections to relativism. You have to be very, very careful because it's so easy to come up with simplistic and stupid notions of relativism, which of course are obviously false. So, let me help you to avoid some of those very obvious, foolish versions of relativism. So first of all, Leo, if relativism is true, how is it that snow is white is relative? It's relative in more than one way. So first of all, snow is white. You would have to actually analyze the words in that proposition. Snow is white. All of those words, first of all, are heavily laden with ontology and various metaphysical assumptions. Just to get two people to agree on what snow means is not as easy as you think, or what white means is not as easy as you think. But even if we put all those linguistic issues and ontological sort of semantic issues to the side, and we just take that word simplistically the way that most people mean it, even in that case, snow is white. Like, in which universe? Under your normal waking consciousness? What if you're in a dream? Is snow white in a dream? What if you're on a psychedelic? What if you're hallucinating? What if you have some visual problem in your nervous system? You know, with your visual system, you have some tick in your nervous system. Is it still going to appear white or some other color? You see? So snow is white is relative to many factors, including your nervous system, your perceptual system, how you use language. Even just to say snow is white, that's a very gross abstraction. Which snow are you talking about? Snow is white as an abstraction? I mean, there's no such thing. You can point to a particular piece of snow and you can say that thing is white, maybe. But then, you know, there's different things you could point to. And then how do you know the thing you're pointing to is really what you mean or what you meant when you said snow is white? So there's also a further problem between sort of like the correspondence between specific phenomena in the world and then your abstractions of it. So to say that snow is white, that's not actually a purely empirical statement. That's an abstraction. And then, of course, it's white to you as a human being, but is it white to a snake, to a cow, to a dog, to a cat, to an alien? You see? So it's utterly relative. Next objection. Leo, if I get cancer, how is that relative? Of course, you got to be very careful here with relative. Relative does not just mean that, well, anything goes. Like, you can just think up of any random thing and then it materializes into existence. Or like, if you have some problem, then you can just say, oh, well, it's a relative problem. So like, poof, I can just think it out of existence. Like, I broke my leg, for example, And then, Leo, you're saying that's relative, so I can just now imagine that my leg is not broken and suddenly it's healed? No, it doesn't work like that. See, that's not what relativism means. Relativism doesn't mean you just get to think shit up and then it materializes instantly. That ain't relativism. That's your foolish straw man of relativism. But even in this case of cancer, right? So cancer is still relativistic in the sense that you say, Leo, I got cancer. Well, what do you mean by I exactly? You mean your body? So you're attached to your body now. You've identified yourself with the body. That's not a scientific fact that you are your body. In fact, famous sage Ramana Maharshi, he actually died of cancer. He was deeply enlightened, very awake. Died of cancer. But before he died, I think it was cancer on his arm or something. He got cancer on his arm in his old age. And his followers, they got very concerned because they worshipped him. They looked up to him as though he was God. Well, he was God, but anyways, they looked up to him. And of course, they wanted to cure him of this cancer because, his teeth, they don't want to let their teacher die. So they got all sorts of doctors to come in there and try to help put herbs on it and whatever to cure it. Nothing worked. But as they were putting medicine on the cancer on the arm and trying to fix it, Ramana, supposedly, he just sat there and he just looked at it and he said, don't worry about it. Just leave it. I'll die. It doesn't matter. The body will die. This body is just mud. It's just earth and mud. It doesn't matter. The real I won't die. Because, of course, he transcended the whole notion of being a body. So literally, you want to become immune to cancer? Well, change who you think you are. If you change your identification to something which can't get cancer, then you can't get cancer. Even though, of course, the body can get cancer and the body can die. But that doesn't mean you're the body. So in this sense, there you go. It's relative. Next objection. Leo, how can science be relative? Doesn't science deliver us the truth? It sure seems that way. Science is very deceptive in that we use it to create all this fancy technology, and then we think it must be true, and therefore nothing more needs to be said about it. No, that's not at all the case. Science is relative in many ways. I've already talked about how science is relative to the era that it's being done in. Very much so. The science that will happen in 1,000 years will be so radically different from today's science that we will look back and look at today's science, 21st century science, as the equivalent of doctors bleeding their patients with leeches or some other form of quackery. That's how modern physics will look in 1,000 years. Science is also relative in that it's a very specific epistemic system with various standards, premises, methods, and techniques that it uses. And the very notion of what counts as science is fluid. Science itself changes. By doing more science, you change how you understand what science is, because science, most generally speaking, is simply the investigation of reality. And as you investigate reality, of course, science itself is what? A part of reality. So as you're investigating reality, you're also investigating science, and you're learning how to do science better. And actually, the boundaries of what qualifies as science will change, such that, for example, in 1,000 years, many spiritual techniques, meditative and yogic techniques that today are not counted as science, will be admitted and accepted as legitimate science. So what counts as legitimate science, this very much depends on how we think of science culturally and bureaucratically in our institutions. And you better believe that's going to change. And in fact, science in the next 1,000 years will change more than science did in the first 1,000 years, the last 1,000 years. There's many changes and reforms that are needed to science. And then, of course, Science is actually literally done differently. People assume that, well, science is just universal. Science is not universal. Science is how humans understand the world. If there are aliens out there, one day we meet them, they will have a different version of science than what we have. Radically different, perhaps. In some ways it might be similar, but also radically different. There's even differences between the way men and women do science. Next objection. Leo, but how come scientists agree on the same factual data if you're saying that physics and the actual physical substrate of reality is relative? This is a very good question. First of all, I want you to notice that a lot of scientists do not agree on the data. There's a lot of debate about this, and what science is about is gathering consensus. And a lot of what that is about convincing others of your way of looking at the world. And how you look at the world, of course, affects the kind of data that you see. And a lot of times, one scientist looks at the world this way, gets one kind of data. Another scientist looks at the world using a different set of paradigms and premises, gets a different set of data. And this data, in a sense, is incommensurable. It can't be directly correlated and compared. Now, of course, in very simple cases, scientists do often agree on the data. You know, you can get a ruler, give it to one scientist, give a ruler to another scientist. They can measure an elephant from nose to tail and discover, some common number. Although even that is not always as easy as it seems. So, because rulers are different, measuring instruments are different. It's hard to calibrate them. But let's say they do come up with the same data. You have to understand that there's different levels and layers to relativity. So, for example, the data scientists agree upon is highly contingent upon which states of consciousness both of these scientists are in, and also the fact that they're both humans and they share a similar educational background, similar culture. They work for similar types of institutions. They both grew up in the same era, of course. They have the same similar brains, similar neurology, similar perceptual systems, virtually identical DNA. So all of that is necessary for scientists to be able to agree on data. Try getting two scientists who have even a 1% difference in their DNA to both agree on the same data. That would be very difficult to do. So, see, part of the problem is because really humans are like the only intelligent species that we know of on this planet and in this physical universe. And so the problem is that we're so isolated that we tend to think that we're so good and so smart. And this lets us get away with not acknowledging the relativity of our own deepest held assumptions and worldviews. Because even though we do have lots of different cultures around the planet, still most of the humans who have all these different cultures still have 99% the same DNA, very similar brains, very similar perceptual organs and neurology. And so therefore, of course, we all tend to think alike and we all tend to agree. But, try getting a scientist to agree with some alien scientist from another planet. That would be very, very different. And you could imagine that they would disagree about what the data really is. Also, the notion of data or facts is itself a relative notion, you see, because it's completely contingent upon which state of consciousness you're in. Different states of consciousness produce different data. So when you're dreaming and sleeping, that's one set of data. When you're awake here in the world, that's another set of data, and so on. So, yeah, just because we can both look at a physical object and agree that that's a tree or a cat or something like that, we have the same raw physical data. understand that that's deeply entangled with our entire nervous system. But also I want to address an even deeper point here, which is a point about the absolute. So here, and we're going to also address an additional objection to relativism. A lot of people have a sort of just intuitive, almost knee-jerk reaction against relativism, especially a lot of scientifically minded people, because they tend to just intuit that there must be something about reality which is not subjective, which is an absolute. And it's that which they want to call the data or the facts. And in a certain sense, this intuition is actually correct, because there is the absolute. There is being. And in fact, the only thing there is the absolute. The only thing there is being. And so being is literally the very substrate of everything. But this being that I'm talking about here, this is not the same thing as what you mean when you, as a scientist or as a normal person, have your facts and your data. That is not being. That is a conceptual projection that you're adding on to being. So, in a sense, what I'm saying here is that if you are able to completely overcome your self-agenda, your sense of self, and various kinds of conceptual categories and schemes and paradigms and worldviews and self-deceptions, and even your entire perceptual system, if you're able to overcome all of that, ultimately you will arrive at the absolute truth or at being. That is the thing which grounds everything. But this is so radical and so alien to what any ordinary human person has ever experienced that it's almost pointless to talk about it here, because it is not nearly the same thing as data or facts, the way that scientists think about it. Data and facts are relative. Absolute being is absolute. But what that is, you're not conscious of it yet. You might think that I'm talking about some sort of other universe. That's not it. Absolute being, the irony of it and the difficulty of it is that it's right here, right now. Everything is absolute being, but it is not what you conventionally think of as data or facts or even perceptions. Even though it's not different from perception, it is still not the same thing as human perception. So you can only arrive at being through a state of samadhi or union between subject and object, which I've talked about in past episodes. So in a sense, the reason that scientists can agree to some data or facts is also because there is that absolute, and that absolute is not somewhere else. That absolute is right here, right now. It's just that they're not, and you're not fully conscious of what that is, and you're misinterpreting it with your projections and your worldview. You're kind of lumping it all together, and then you're calling that data and facts. Another objection. Leo, if relativism is true, how come people can still be factually wrong? Because doesn't relativism mean that whatever I believe is just true? Again, that's a very silly notion of relativism. That's not what I'm arguing for here. It's much more nuanced than that. So yes, you can still be factually wrong. Factually here is a relative matter, and even wrong is a relative matter. So again, remember that all of our facts as human beings stem from our neurology and our psychology, our common DNA, our common ancestry, our common culture. So of course, because of this unifies a lot of us together and gets us thinking along the same page. But you can still be factually wrong because, again, your own perspective is relative to past perspectives that you've had. So what it means for you to be factually wrong is that at some point in the future, you recognize that something you said in the past, no longer holds true. And that's because, you're exploring more of reality. You're exploring your own psyche and your own mind, and you're realizing how you might have been deluding yourself, tricking yourself, fooling yourself, misconstruing something, misinterpreting something, or even just simply not observing something carefully enough. So, of course, because of this, you can correct your own worldview and you can admit to yourself that you're wrong. Of course. And somebody could even convince you that you're wrong by presenting a persuasive argument. That's because you're able to compare what you believed before to what you are being proposed by this other person. And then you're going to put them side by side. Again, relativistically, you can compare them, and then you can decide that, oh, well, maybe the thing I held before really didn't make much sense. And again, why do you change your belief? You change your belief precisely because you're comparing various perspectives in your own mind. You're kind of juxtaposing them, and you're trying to fit them together like a jigsaw puzzle. So the reason you accept some new theory or idea is because it fits better with your total picture of reality than some other part that you used to have. And it helps you in some way. So in this sense, it's a very relativistic matter. Another objection. So Leo, does relativism mean that for flat earthers, the earth actually is flat? Is that what you're saying? Or is the earth actually round? And then the flat earthers are deluded? Which one is it? Again, it's a little bit tricky here. We need to think about this in multiple ways. From a certain perspective, it actually is sort of the case that for a flat earther, the earth actually is flat. From their point of view, that sort of is true, which is exactly why these flat earthers can be so radical, and they can be like so fully bought in to their worldview that literally when a flat earther gets on an airplane and he's flying, he could look at the horizon of the earth and he could say, look, it's flat. It's going to look flat to him. Because you see, you don't just experience the earth. Largely how you experience the earth is not just by simply observing it. It's all the stuff that you also project onto it. See? So your expectations and your metaphysics actually colors your perceptions. Such that, for example, if you look at somebody that you hate, you'll actually look at them and you'll see them, you'll perceive them as being more ugly than they really are, because your eyes are actually being colored by that hatred and judgment that you have. You're not able to see them properly and clearly. Now, of course, if the flat earther eventually, flew into outer space and looked down on the earth, maybe he would see a globe. And then this would be a problem for him. But again, this is still relative. Still relative. Because this is happening within his own consciousness. This round earth that he's seeing or not seeing, it's happening within his own consciousness. And in this sense, it's relative. So what I'm saying is that, for example, when the flat earther dies, the earth will disappear for him. There will not be an earth. It won't be flat and it won't be round. And in a sense, even as we're sitting here talking about the earth, it sounds as though we're talking about some real object. Actually, you have only an image in your mind of the earth. It's purely a concept for you. You have very little direct experience of the actual earth. So keep that in mind. I am not saying, of course, that just by thinking the earth is flat, that when you fly into outer space and you look down, it'll actually be flat for that person. And for another person who believes the earth is round and he flies into outer space, he'll see it as round. I'm not saying that, right? It's a much more subtle thing that's being said here. But I am also saying that the actual physical earth is relative. For example, when you're dreaming, the earth doesn't exist. Before you were born, the earth didn't exist at all. And after you die, it won't exist for you. And from your point of view, That's all that matters. You might say, oh, Leo, but the Earth will still exist. I'll just be dead, but the Earth will still continue to exist. No, it won't. The only reason you can think that is because right now you're alive. So when you're dead, the Earth will not continue to exist. Because what it means to say that the Earth exists is that it exists for you from your perspective, not independently of you. You're imagining that the Earth can exist independently of you, but that's you imagining it as long as you're alive. See, it's twisted here. It's tricky. Another objection, Leo, how can history be relative? Well, this objection is very easy to answer. It should really be obvious. All history is highly partial. You never see a complete history of mankind or a civilization or even of an individual person. You're always cherry-picking elements and piecing stuff together and interpolating and interpreting it. You don't really know the true history of Rome or of Egypt or of even individual people. You don't know the true history or biography of Hitler or any other person throughout history, really. This is highly relative. And then the way you see history is highly shaped by how you want to see it. And it colors your whole worldview. And then your worldview colors how you interpret history as well. See, do you see history as a constant progression towards freedom? Or maybe you see history as various power dynamics and power struggles. Or maybe you see history as just an evolution, a fractal evolution, or advances in technology, or maybe you see it as advances in biology or whatever. You know, there's different ways of looking at it, and each one of those is highly, highly relative. True history, you might say, is this infinite thing out of which you're plucking out individual strands, and then you're highlighting and emphasizing those. Of course, a very common objection is, well, Leo, how can good and evil be relative? This is such an obvious one that I don't even want to go into it in depth. I've covered the relativity of good and evil many times in prior episodes. Go check out my episode called What is the Devil? That explains the mechanics of good and evil and how relative it is. Basically, what good and evil really are, in the way that most people mean them, is it's simply that which aids your survival. What aids your survival, you call good. What hinders your survival, you call evil. And of course, your survival is completely relative to who you are, such that every person generally has vastly different survival strategies, and therefore they have very vastly different notions of good and evil. And that's why people disagree about good and evil so much all throughout history and up to this day. Another objection is, well, Leo, does this mean that Hitler was actually good and that he was as good as Jesus? Because you're saying that good and evil are just relative. So are Hitler and Jesus equivalent? Again, remember, I'm not saying that things are totally equal. So I'm not saying Hitler was equal to Jesus. They were very different. They lived different lives. They communicated differently, and they interacted with people differently. And Hitler ended up killing a lot more people than Jesus did. So those are important differences. Now, is it good? Is it bad? This all depends on your perspective. Is killing good or bad in your mind? Killing is not objectively good or bad. It just depends on, again, what you want, what your goals are, who you are. So Hitler is not as good as Jesus. It just is what it is. And then you are attaching these labels to it. Another objection. Leo, how can we build a society if all values are relative, as you're saying? Again, relativism does not mean that we can't cooperate together, that we can't build a consensus, we can't come to some agreements. We can. Of course we can. Largely because we share the same DNA, we share the same brains, the same neurology, the same perceptions. We are in the same environment for the most part. We are all humans. We basically have very similar needs for our survival. Of course, there's minor differences, but we have certain basic requirements, and based on that, which all of that is not absolute, that's all relative. Because, you could have been born an orangutan rather than human, in which case you would not be able to build a society with humans. Orangutans and humans can't build a society together. It don't work. Orangutans don't even understand what a society is, and they probably don't even need one. So because we have so much commonality, we're the same species, basically, that's why we have common needs and common values. Now, of course, in practice, it's so difficult precisely because even though we're all humans, there's so much disagreement that it's very difficult to get a consensus about how to build a good society and what it means to build a good society. Our values are very different depending on our culture and what part of the world we live in. And even within that, still so many disagreements. Even within the same family, you've got so many disagreements between what is right and what is wrong, and what is good and what is bad, and what is needed and what's not needed. Next objection. But Leo, Einstein said that the speed of light isn't relative, it's a constant. So doesn't that contradict your relativity here? Well, 2 points about that. First of all, the speed of light is not truly a constant because it varies depending on the medium that it's in. So it's relative to the medium. Now you could say, well, but Leo, I'm specifically talking about the speed of light in a vacuum. Well, first of all, there's no such thing as a vacuum. A perfect vacuum doesn't exist. So you're talking about some idealization. But even if we grant you that and we say, okay, the speed of light in a vacuum is totally constant. First of all, understand that right now scientists are actually debating this point. It's not clear that the speed of light is actually a constant. Some scientists have actually proposed that there are tiny, minute, down to the thousands and millions of a decimal point fluctuations within the speed of light, and that is not just because our instruments are not good enough to measure it accurately, but they're actually saying that this is inherent to sort of the background noise of space-time itself. So that's an interesting theory. It hasn't been proven or disproven yet. It's just, they're still working this stuff out. So that's a possibility. And of course, that would mean that it's relative. Also, the speed of light could change with the history of the universe. We don't actually know if the speed of light has been constant throughout the entire birth of the whole universe that we're in. There could be other universes in which the speed of light is a different speed. It could also be the case that, for example, the speed of light is actually relative to the universe that we're in and the rate at which the universe is expanding. And of course, if you've studied the expansion of the universe is not actually a constant, it's accelerating. And actually, it's been said that the universe accelerates, either is accelerating now or has accelerated in the past, at speeds faster than the speed of light. See? So maybe inside of the universe, the speed of light is whatever it is, and it's a constant. But then that doesn't really determine what can happen outside of it, outside the universe. All right, so there's a lot of potentially nested contexts here and various frames of reference that you have to take into account. So it may not be as constant as we tell ourselves. Another objection. So Leo, does this mean that enlightenment is also relative? Because you talk about enlightenment. Don't you have to be consistent here and admit that enlightenment can be false? And the answer is no. Enlightenment is, we might say, the one thing which is not relative. It is the absolute. Enlightenment is awakening to that absolute that I've been alluding to throughout this episode. That's the whole beauty and radical nature of enlightenment, is that it's precisely the thing which gets you out of relativity. And what that is, you can't possibly imagine until you experience it for yourself and you actually awaken. Another objection. But Leo, aren't you contradicting yourself here? Because it sounds like you want me to accept everything that you say, and what you're saying is that everything is relative. But you want me to accept it as an absolute. Isn't it the case, Leo, that everything you're saying here is relative? So isn't your own theory eating itself alive? Because you're saying everything is relative, but you want to say that that's true, which is precisely what we can't say if we want to say that everything is relative. This is a very good point, and this is a common mistake that many postmodernists make, is they try to say, for example, that everything is relative, for example, all morals are relative, and they go one step further, and this is their mistake, is they say, yes, all value systems and morals are relative, and therefore we shouldn't prefer one over the other. We shouldn't marginalize any one. We should treat them all equally. But of course, there is no such should. Just because all value systems are relative doesn't mean that some value systems aren't more useful in certain situations than others. Again, depends on your goals. But let's return back to this point more directly about me contradicting myself. The nature of the absolute is that when you speak about it, it contradicts itself, because language is dualistic and relative. You can't speak about the absolute without contradicting yourself. This is not a mistake or an error or an oversight on my part. I'm actually deeply aware of this, and you need to become deeply aware of it too. So even though there is the absolute, nothing I'm saying here is the absolute. So if I said that this video and everything I'm saying here, I want you to take as the absolute, and that this is the absolute truth, if I said that, then you'd be right. I'd be a hypocrite. But I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that everything I'm saying here is also relative. So I'm actually in accordance with what I'm saying. I'm saying everything is relative, including language, and this is part of language, and these are thoughts, these are concepts. It's all relative. But there is an absolute. Me saying there is an absolute is not the absolute. That's still relative. Don't make that mistake. But if we go beyond all the words to that which cannot be pointed to or spoken or communicated or thought or imagined, that is the absolute. And me saying that is still relative. So the point you have to get here is that there's just absolutely no way to communicate the absolute. But it's there. So this is the finger pointing at the moon, and you need to go beyond focusing on the finger and actually go to the moon. And so if you keep insisting that I contradict myself, that's you looking at the finger, because you're looking at my words and my thoughts and concepts and my teachings, which of course are relative. I'm not saying my teachings are absolute. I'm saying that my teachings can, perhaps, if you do the work, one day get you to realize that there's something beyond the teachings, beyond the relative, that which cannot be spoken, that which is read between the lines, which cannot be explicated in any way. And that will be the absolute truth. And you will know it for yourself, but you yourself will also not be able to think it or communicate it to anybody else. That's the very radical and paradoxical nature of the absolute. So are all my teachings relative? Of course they are. None of my teachings can capture all of reality. My teachings cannot capture the whole elephant. All they are just maps and models, little tiny photographs of the elephant's ass, not the whole elephant. You got to go and experience the whole elephant for yourself. All I'm doing is I'm telling you that there is an elephant that you can go explore, and you can discover all of its nooks and crannies and various aspects in detail. And I will never be able to speak them all to you. So my teachings are not a substitute for you realizing the entire elephant. In fact, really, for you realizing that you are the entire elephant. So when I'm talking about the elephant, I'm really just talking about you. So those are all the objections. Now we're wrapping up here. I just want to conclude by saying that understanding relativity, I hope you can start to see, is absolutely crucial for understanding reality and for going deep into your own personal development work. That's why we're covering this topic. This is not just philosophy. If you want to know more about the absolute and you're curious, go check out my many videos about the absolute. Check out my video about Aztec non-duality. Check out my 2-part series on understanding absolute infinity, part 1 and part 2. Check out my video about what is God, part 1 and part 2. That all explains the absolute, and I have many more episodes that explain the absolute. So search for those. I've talked about it many, many, many times, so I don't want to rehash all of that here. That's it for part 1. Make sure you stay tuned for part 2. Believe it or not, we still have a lot to say about relativity. And that's it. We're done here for today. Please click that like button for me, and come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. You'll find my blog with various insights that I post, exclusive videos. I recently posted a deep awakening experience that I had exclusively on my blog in video form. Go check that out. Might be interesting to you. Check out my book list. Check out the Life Purpose course. Check out the forum where you can discuss the stuff and ask your questions. And finally, I never want you to ever just take the things that I say on faith. The point of these videos is to get you to start thinking for yourself, to contemplate all of these points carefully. This is very advanced stuff, and you're not going to be able to understand it if all you do is you just sit there and passively listen and just nod your head and accept it all and then move on to the next video. That's not going to work. I expect you to think about this stuff, question it, challenge it, play devil's advocate, but again, not so much towards me, because that just becomes a projection, but rather with yourself. Sit down and think through these various points I made, various objections, come up with your own objections, and then try to defeat them, try to answer them, try to really understand what is relativity, rather than just being a skeptic or a cynic and just telling me, oh, Leo, relativity is all horseshit, here's why you're wrong. Rather than doing that, instead, make the counterintuitive move and actually just start from the point of saying, okay, relativity, if relativity is true, how can it be true? And then actually think through it as though it were true. That's a much better way to explore and try to understand what something is, by assuming it to be true rather than by assuming it to be false. You know, like if you want to understand, for example, what Christianity is, you need to enter Christianity assuming that it's true, not that it's false. Because if you assume that it's false, you're not going to understand Christianity. Likewise with any other worldview. For example, if you really want to understand Nazism, start reading Nazi books assuming that they're all true, not that they're false. Now, that doesn't mean that I want you to accept Nazism as true. This is just a sort of a mental exercise you're doing. You know, an intelligent person can assume something is true, look at the world from that perspective for a while, sometimes for days, for months, for years even, and then switch it off and say, okay, well, that was just a thought experiment. Now let me look at it this other way. Let me assume that it was false. Or let me assume something else was true that contradicted that other thing that I was holding as true. You got to be cognitively flexible enough to be able to jump back and forth between different perspectives like this. This is one of the keys to this work. And lastly, I want you to notice if you get emotionally triggered or reactive against relativity in any way. And I want you to pinpoint those exact places. Are you triggered by moral relativism, epistemic relativism, ontological relativism? Are you triggered that time and space are relative, or that Hitler being bad and evil is relative, or about slavery or whatever? Notice those and watch those very carefully, and then question those and ask yourself, why am I getting triggered by this? There is something very valuable for you to discover there, because really the only reason you ever get triggered about anything is because it threatens your survival and sense of self and your worldview, which is very integral to your sense of self and to your entire life and to your survival strategy. So that is where the real work is done here, is by observing your emotional reactions. Anytime you get emotionally reacted by anything that I say, turn inwards and find that thing within yourself which is the cause of you being triggered. That's how you'll really grow. Not by ranting at me with your objections and your opinions and telling me how wrong I am. This doesn't help grow you. This is a complete distraction. And of course, this doesn't mean that I can't be wrong. Of course I can be wrong. I'm fallible, which is precisely why I want you to contemplate this stuff, just in case I make an error somewhere or I delude myself. You can catch me on that error. The way you catch me on an error is not by being cynical and skeptical about the things I say, but rather by taking the things I say seriously and contemplating them for yourself and then actually discovering what's really true. That's how you debunk me. Not by creating stupid reaction debunking videos. That's all just ego. It's all just a waste of time, which is why I don't really even like to respond to that sort of stuff. So there you go. Stay tuned for part 2.